Masterclass for Polatschek's Advanced Studies for the Clarinet. Today we are covering Etude 27 after Arnold Schoenberg's 20th century masterpiece, Pierrot Lunaire. Now, the full title of this work is actually 3x7 poems from Albert Gio's Pierrot Lunaire, more commonly known simply as Pierrot Lunaire, Opus 21. It is a melodrama by Arnold Schoenberg. In this chamber work, Schoenberg created a setting of 21 selected poems. That would be 21 movements from Albert Gio's cycle of the same exact name. Looking back, the piece actually originates a commission. Schoenberg was working through a period of atonality with a more disciplined approach to his 12-tone method, still looming in the future. Upon meeting a Viennese actress named Albertine Zemi, he commissioned Schoenberg to compose these new musical concepts of poetry that she had been performing as part of her own repertoire. Zemi's performances featured an exaggerated recitation style with accompaniment that kind of resembled a variant of the melodrama genre. While each movement of this work inhabits a remarkably distinctive world, Schoenberg traces an overarching three-part narrative structure ranging from ecstasy to inspiration to hallucination to a very expressive use of spectromy and free atonality, all capstone elements of Pierrot Lunaire as a consummate work. Pierrot Lunaire is probably one of Schoenberg's most celebrated and frequently performed works. Its instrumentation is for flute, clarinet with auxiliaries, violoncello, piano, and the addition of vocalist that showcases a very kaleidoscopic variety of timbres. It includes an all-important interplay between the instruments and the voice, which was very, I would say, innovative for its time when it was commissioned. Getting into the music, we are in 4/4 time with a tempo marking of moderato at quarter note equals 70. We are going to be using a lot more freedom throughout since we are trying to convey multiple personalities and narrative arcs throughout. We have several movements that have been clumped into one etude. Sometimes we're going from back-to-back concepts. I think he even reorders some of the motivic elements even from the first movement to try and create this one etude that we're working with. So because we're dealing with a large chamber work that has been condensed into a singular concept, pacing, character contrast, and dynamics are going to be really important to making this etude sound both expressive and interesting. As the first and only 20th century atonal work in this book, I think this is a really fantastic opportunity to explore a genre of repertoire that's typically reserved for specialized chamber music ensembles or a solo recital that you're pursuing. Given the technical demands of this etude, I'd probably say the objective for this 27th study, if we're going to give it one, is going to be creating phrases that address all expressive markings and applying all previous concepts that are learned throughout the book. We have a lot going on through here, but throughout this, we can basically take everything that we learned for the past 26 etudes, cherry pick what we've learned from those, and apply it to this one etude. Everything from hand position to intervallic and rhythmic consistency to articulation in any context. Each one of these pedagogical concepts can be applied into this 27th etude and allow us to play this with a little bit more ease instead of just seeing a bunch of ink on the page that is maybe a little bit more intimidating to look at. Right now, I would suggest practicing this entire etude to the 8th note instead of to the quarter note. Since the second page of this etude is much more rhythmically dense, it'll be very important to have a very strong internal pulse so that the music does not feel overly frantic or rushed despite the style that we're trying to communicate. For example, since the etude is marked at a quarter note equals 70, I would set my metronome to quarter note equals 50 as maybe a starting tempo, and then double this value so that we're now playing to 8th note equals 100. With this now in mind, the 32nd note should be much more manageable and not look so dense on the page. I think for me, I always find this approach to be a little bit more manageable, as I said, more calm, and more sensible when dealing with music that is highly rhythmic and very technical. Measure 1, we are starting with an adaptation of the original material from the 15th poem, 15th movement, titled Homesickness, which is also the beginning of part 3 of the larger chamber work. Now, for the most part, we're dealing with material that is taken straight from the score until measure 23 from the 15th movement. We're playing a very similar adaptation of the clarinet part in A from the original score as seen here. I would definitely suggest checking out a few recordings of this work to get an idea of how the clarinet fits in with the greater context of this work, especially considering that in the original work we are often accompanying the singer throughout, and the clarinet is not actually the main voice, it's a supporting voice. In this etude, we are playing as a solo instrument, so obviously we're the only thing that matters. But if we were playing this in an orchestra, chamber orchestra, we would definitely want to be a little more aware of what's happening around us. Now, beginning this etude until measure 5, remember that we are trying to convey a very specific mood, very specific character. Play with as much rubato as you like, but make sure to pay attention to the pacing so that the poco ritardando happens without dragging too much. I think the trill should be light, focused, and have a very small diminuendo that prepares the next idea. Play with lots of expression and tell a story that communicates an idea of isolation or loneliness. Again, we're really trying to work within the confines of this poem, this movement, so try to really speak to whatever the poem's about, and I think you'll be on track. For measure 5 to 6, we have an ascending phrase octuplets based on another phrase from the original scoring. For these groupings, practice using the 8th note as the pulse so that they do not feel rushed, making sure to get off the ties on time as well. For the F sharp 5 on the and of B2, we're going to be using the 4th fingering so we don't have to flip between the E sharp that follows. On the 2nd page, there's several other F sharp to E sharp 5s that will require the use of the 4th finger as well. Won't go over those because we've done a lot of that in the previous etudes, but just keep in mind that that will be a very integral part of making sure the technique is easy. Additionally, for the ritardando that occurs at the final octuplet, this can be played with a bit more weight, stretching out these notes so that we really can hear the anticipation of what is to come in that next motive. So next up, we have a beginning of a new motive that actually occurs before the material that we just played in the original score. And as I mentioned, Polatschek has kind of reordered these motivic elements to create this one etude. So this next part actually came before the part that we just played in the original work. This new idea should be very abrupt, provide a huge contrast to the expressive legato line that we just played, almost to create a split personality between both sections. For the grace notes found in measure 8 and 9, these should be played on the beat and sound very light and snappy. Additionally, I would make sure to emphasize on dynamics and written hairpins for measures 9 to 11 to add more direction. Without these, the phrase will sound very monotone and lack the energy that's needed to create the next phrase on that forte. Lastly, keep in mind that the written E4s to C sharp 4 sforzandos will likely go flat depending on your clarinet, so make sure to use a tuner and know how to anticipate these nuances and instances based on your tuning tendencies. At measure 12, we have a flourish of 30-second notes that will ascend to a written C6. This should be played more or less in time. You can take a little bit of rubato if you want. From the beginning, I definitely did that. I think the word flourish generally indicates with liberty. It should just sound very easy, very abrupt, out of nowhere. So as long as it's clean, it sounds good, I think the idea is coming across more or less in the right way. Taking this lick apart, I would definitely mark in some brackets so that the groupings are maybe a little bit more easy to read. For the sextuplet that starts it, I would add brackets to create 2 triplets, and then a third for the 4th grouping that precedes the dotted A flat 5. Sometimes I like to do this when the groupings are a little more dense, especially for something that's more atonal, that doesn't necessarily follow a pattern. It's a little bit easier for me to read if it's bracketed and it's a little bit more structured in a way that's organized and easier to practice. Now in measure 14, we have a repeat of the opening motive, this time played in the Altissimo register. Marked at a piano, enter this line at a comfortable dynamic level and keep the air moving at all times. Focus, remembering to use a T syllable for all articulation markings above a C6. I know there's a lot of different opinions on articulation. I won't go into that right now. But for me, I like to use a T syllable for anything above a C6 and then a 2 syllable for anything below that. Since this line is a bit softer in volume, the tendency will be to use more tension, heavier articulation, and less air. Doing the opposite, pick a G6 fingering that makes the most sense for you, and then try to add a bit more length to the staccato notes instead. When playing short in the upper registers, sometimes we tend to overdo it, so as long as the air is focused and the articulation is happening correctly, the notes in this register should naturally sound a bit more short on their own, as opposed to the lower registers that typically require a little bit more emphasis to sound short. So, and as I've said before, in other etudes, the clarinet is all about balancing. The registers are not built equally, so if we want to have the lower register sound as crisp as the upper register, we have a little bit more work to do than the upper register, which is naturally a little bit more articulate. At measure 19, we have a new idea, and as before, this motive should sound very abrupt and playful compared to the previous idea. Similar to the last instances, the grace notes found here should also be played on the beat. For the D flat 6 on beat 1, this note should be played as an alternative trill fingering using the standard C6 paired with our bottom 2 side keys. Using this option really eliminates the need to cross the register break up top and provides a much smoother transition between the 2 notes. Also considering we are at a piano marking, we don't want to have to go between the break and interrupt this melodic line that we're trying to create. In measure 20, the engraving in this etude book actually has an error. For the 32nd sextuplet on beat 2, this should actually be read as a 16th sextuplet, so take away that top line in engraving. And then in measure 21, we have another error. This should actually be an F sharp 3 on beat 1. Measure 21, beat 1, F sharp, and then the first 8th note should also be an F sharp to the F natural on the and of 2. In measure 26, as before, the octuplet should be played in time, legato, to complement the indicated calm expressive marking. At measure 27, the second half of beat 1 should almost feel as a set of grace notes leading into the final 16th. And for the remainder of this phrase until measure 30, this material should be very legato and lyrical to contrast the rest of the etude that is much more highly rhythmical. So really make sure to savor these lyrical expressive moments. A lot of this, as I've said, is kind of split personality. It's very black and white, hot and cold. So really make sure that you understand how to pace this in a way that makes sense. Otherwise, it's just going to sound very abrupt without needing to. We definitely want to have that abruptness, but it needs to happen very thematically with the narrative in mind. At measure 30, we're now playing material from movement 18 titled The Moonspot, consisting of highly rhythmic interjections and lots of dynamic contrast to conclude the etude. As a general suggestion, I would go through the second page and place a vertical dash over each large beat to make sure the counting is a little bit more easy during your practice. I think since we're dealing with a lot of 30-second note groupings, these can sometimes be a little more challenging to read, so mapping out your score can be very helpful to prevent rushing or compressing the beats. Additionally, you might also want to make note of any dynamic changes that are easy to miss. I think like everything in this etude that's preceded this section, practicing slowly to the 8th note will be the best way to understand this rhythmic pacing and avoid letting the technique override the music. And with that, we've reached the end of Etude 27 in Victor Polatschek's Advanced Studies for the Clarinet. Having reached the end of this masterclass, I hope you've gained a little bit of knowledge that prepares you for a very beautiful, fantastic performance in the future. In case you have any additional questions on this Etude, as always, please feel free to comment below or send me a note. In the meantime, thank you so much for clicking today, and I'll see you next time for the final Etude in this series, Etude 28. Have a practicing, stay safe, and see you again soon.